Your Excellency, thanks so much for joining CNBC. Why don't you walk me through how the meeting between President Biden and the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia went yesterday?
It went very well, and it was very comprehensive, and it covered all of the issues that are of importance, and that has been reflected in the various statements put out by the two sides. The President brought up the issue of Jamal Khashoggi, as you mentioned, and His Royal Highness's response was that this is an issue that is tremendously painful for Saudi Arabia, that we dealt with this matter, that it was investigated, that it was referred to the courts, and that the courts issued verdicts against the accused, and a number of them have been sentenced to serve time in jail, and they're doing so as we speak. So we took action. The people were punished, and that Saudi Arabia put in place mechanisms to ensure that this doesn't happen again. And the Crown Prince made the point that mistakes happen in many places. The year Jamal Khashoggi was murdered, a number of other journalists were murdered around the world. What has happened in dealing with them? The mistakes are made, including by the United States. We all recall Abu Ghraib, and His Highness made the point that the United States investigated, held people responsible, and put in place mechanisms to ensure that it doesn't happen again. This is what civilized countries do. Unfortunately, there are mistakes that are made by other countries where people don't do what needs to be done, and that's not the case of Saudi Arabia. We have a recent case that His Royal Highness brought up, the killing of the Palestinian American journalist in Israel, and the question was, what is the United States doing about it, and what are others doing about this case? So mistakes happen, unfortunately, in many places, and the key is how you deal with it. And in Saudi Arabia, we have taken very serious steps and very effective steps to not only deal with it, but also put in place mechanisms to ensure it doesn't happen again.
So you'd say the United States and Saudi Arabia today are on the same page?
I believe the issue of human rights, for example, came up in terms of a general context, and His Royal Highness' response is that we're very serious about human rights. We care about our people. We care about their right to security, their right to jobs, and their right to healthcare, their right to education, their right to opportunity, and we have our own value system, and countries have different value systems, and you cannot impose values by one country on another country. You have to respect the different values. The United States tried to impose or export its values to Afghanistan and Iraq, and it backfired. It doesn't work.
Do you think that's what they're trying to do to Russia and Ukraine?
I think it's not. There are values that we all can agree on. There are values that are unique to different countries, but we can't expect the people we deal with to share our values 100%. If that were the case, and His Royal Highness made this point to the President, he said, if you want to deal with countries that share your values totally, the only countries you're dealing with will probably be in Western Europe. We have differences. It doesn't mean that one is good and one is bad. It just means that countries have certain uniquenesses to them, and this is something that we deal with through dialogue, through interaction, and the more we engage with each other, the more we trade, the more we invest, the more we have cultural exchanges, the more we have dialogue, I think the more we move towards a common worldview. But until we get there, we each have to respect our different values and our different cultures.
Earlier today, the Crown Prince reiterated that when it comes to energy policy, rational policies are needed in order to avoid further global inflation. When you look at the West's response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, are you worried about the hit that the global economy is taking as a result of the West's actions? Because more and more sanctions, now we're talking about a cap on Russian oil prices. I mean, how worrying is this to you? Because Saudi Arabia can do a lot, but they can't be totally responsible for energy markets globally. Yes. There are a lot of different players.
Yes, anytime you have a war in the heart of Europe, it's very concerning, because we know what happened in World War I, we know what happened in World War II. They both started with a conflict in the heart of Europe. And anytime you have a war anywhere in the world, it's an issue of major concern, because it has disruptive elements and effects to it. We have said from the very beginning, we supported the UN General Assembly resolution about the inadmissibility of use of force, about the sovereignty of nations and respect for that. And we have called for a peaceful resolution to this. A, stop the fighting, and two, get to the negotiating table and work out your differences peacefully. The concern that we have is that escalation on one side leads to escalation on the other side, and before we know it, things are more likely to spin out of control, and we all pay the price. We've seen the dislocations in terms of global supply chains, we've seen the dislocations in terms of energy markets, we've seen the dislocation in terms of refugees, we've seen the dislocation in terms of food. And we're at our point, and we've reached out to both Russia and to Ukraine, and we've urged them to move towards a ceasefire and settlement of their conflict peacefully. We continue to be engaged with them, as are a number of other countries, and our hope is that they will be able to recognize that it's better to argue across from each other, across the table from each other, than fight across the battlefield from each other, because of the unintended consequences of war and conflict.
Did that come up in the conversations between the Saudis and the Americans?
We have had a conversation with the U.S. about this since the conflict began. In terms of the meetings or the summit, came up in terms of the importance of trying to find a peaceful or negotiated settlement to this conflict, one, and two, how do we deal with allowing the export of grains from both Russia and Ukraine to world markets. We have a food crisis where countries do not have access to enough wheat and enough corn and enough food products.
Saudi Arabia supports a lot of those countries.
Correct, and
like Egypt, like Lebanon, etc.
Correct, and we have worked on setting up a fund with our GCC partners and others in the region for $10 billion to provide help with food security in the MENA region. But we have challenges in South America, in the Caribbean. We have challenges in Asia. We have this is a global issue. Another challenge we have is lack of fertilizer, because a lot of the fertilizer that's sold around the world is produced in Russia, and now you have countries that don't have access to fertilizers will not be able to produce as much food next year as they could have if they had access to fertilizer. So this will prolong this food crisis. But that's one very important component of this crisis. And there are others that emerge. And so the important issue is, how do we ensure that we have adequate supply of food to countries? How do we ensure that we have adequate supplies of fertilizers? We're trying to encourage more production of fertilizer. How do we ensure that we deal with reconstruction, and we deal with the issue of refugees? But most importantly, how do we move towards a ceasefire?
Could Saudi Arabia be a conduit there? And I raise this point not just because of the relationship that you've grown with Russia over the last few years as a member of OPEC+, but you also have a very strong relationship with Beijing, and half of their oil supplies come from Saudi Arabia and other Gulf Arab countries. So it leads one to wonder if Saudi Arabia couldn't really be an interlocutor in some of these conversations, some of these problems where you have West versus China,
Yes.
West versus Russia.
Yes.
What is the Saudi role in your view?
We try to do that, and because of the importance of it. We are a player on the global economic system, and we are a player in the global political system. We are a country that is connected to the world. We have investments in the world financial system. We are a big player in the energy system. We are the birthplace of Islam and custodian of the two holy mosques, so we have a central role in the Islamic world, to which 1.7 billion Muslims belong. These are all, we are right next to three of the world's most strategic waterways, Strait of Hormuz, Bab el-Mandeb, the Suez Canal. We straddle virtually three continents, Asia, Africa, and Europe, so we are important as a transportation hub. So what happens in the world has an impact on us. Stability and security in the world means you have the ability to trade and prosper, and we benefit. Instability in the world means you disrupt trade and commerce, and you diminish prosperity, and it impacts negatively on us. Wars are terrible. They're the worst in terms of impact for trade and investment and prosperity. So we have been reaching out and engaging with Russia and with Ukraine to try to see if we can't find common ground, and we have done this also in partnership with our GCC allies. We have done this in consultation with our Western allies.
Any progress?
You have to keep trying, and I think a number of other countries have tried, and we can't give up. We have to continue to see what we are available. We can't force a settlement on either sides, but we say to them, look, we're a country that has good relations with both sides, and we are prepared to act as a bridge or a facilitator for you to try to overcome your differences through negotiations rather than through warfare. So that's in terms of Ukraine. In terms of the issue with China, we have, again, we see that the conflict with China is disruptive to the world, and we believe that we want to make sure that there are no misunderstandings or miscalculations that end up leading to the law of unintended consequences. And we believe that the integration of China into the global economic system is important to the stability of the system, and we believe that trade, especially open trade, and human history and economic history has shown us that if you remove trade barriers and you enhance trade, everybody benefits. When you compete in an open playing field, everybody benefits. But if you try to close yourself off or engage in what used to be called beggar thy neighbor policies, everybody loses. And we don't want that, because we are our prosperity and our interests are linked to an open economic system globally and to free trade. So it's in our interest to try to find or to build bridges between different camps in the international system. Of course, America is our most important strategic ally, and that's where we are and that's who we work with. But that doesn't mean we cannot try to use our relationships with other countries to try to help narrow gaps.
Your Excellency, thank you so much for joining CNBC.
Thank you.